how many years have you devoted your life to helping children?
I would say close to 70.
And in those 70 years, you've mentored and supervised thousands of child psychiatrists.
I couldn't even count them because each person I've seen will learn from me and then teach 100 other people who will then teach 100 other people. So I feel that my one self has been able to make a contribution to so many people who are carrying on my particular ideals of what a child psychiatrist should be.
Now, Clarice, going all the way back, can you tell us where you were born and where you grew up?
Well, actually, I was born in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. And I grew up there in the wonderful days where there was no smog, there was blue sky, green grass, and it was very wonderful with Charlie Chaplin and the Keystone Cops right in front of my house on Barton Avenue in Hollywood, doing all of their wonderful things. And I lived in Los Angeles in a very modest midtown kind of apartment then, a little house until age 7. And then we moved to a beautiful house in Westwood, which was then really like a forest. So I grew up in the wild part of Westwood, which was 2 blocks from UCLA. And the reason my parents moved me there was because they insisted that I would go to UCLA no matter what. So that was my very first early experience. My father was a wonderful physician, great humanitarian. He was one of the first graduates at age 24 from the University of Denver, now the University of Colorado, in medicine. He had moved to Los Angeles a few years later with one child, my half-sister, and his old father. My mother's family had come from Odessa, Russia. My mother was a tremendously good musician, pianist. In fact, she played in the silent films when she was 14 years old in the movie theaters. She supplied all the music that you hear in The Perils of Pauline and all of those wonderful early newsreels. She would play exciting piano. So my mother and father were both in LA. My father came out to Los Angeles in 1924, and he had opened an office. And I remember as a very young child going with him to the office, and it was full of the most amazing things that I used to see looking through the door. There would be an ovarian cyst, 100 pounds, taken from a woman who only weighed 90 pounds. There would be a 2-headed fetus. There would be anencephalic monsters, we call them. He had a little museum, all in formaldehyde. So I was very early on seeing some of the weirdest things, plus watching him do treatments with arsenicals and soundings for people who'd come all over the country. Now, my mother was a very wonderful piano teacher. She had her own show in Hollywood, and I used to listen every week to her playing, and her students would play. She decided that I should learn, and she was my teacher. Think of all the lessons that I learned as a future child psychiatrist. I think I learned from my earliest days, from my parents, and from where I grew up. So one day, I remember I must have been 5 years old. I had been studying piano with my mother, and she'd come to the door, knock on the door, and say, "Is Clarissa here?" That was my name that I was given. I changed it myself to Clarice when I was about 8. But "Is Clarissa here for her? I'm Miss Sachs for her music lesson." So mother would come in, go to the piano, I'd have my lesson, and I would learn a little Mozart, little Beethoven pieces. And one day she came to the door and said, "Hello, is Clarissa here? I'm Miss Sachs, her music teacher." I said, "Clarissa doesn't live here anymore," and slammed the door. Now, my mother was so smart. I got so many lessons from her. She knew that it was time to get me a teacher other than my mother. And so she got me a wonderful teacher, Miss Brown, who was our neighbor. And so I continued my piano lessons with the neighbor, and my mother would only then just be a mother. I think it's pretty obvious that most of my professional life has been devoted to my thinking about becoming a child psychiatrist. But what is a child psychiatrist and what does a child psychiatrist actually do? This is really a problem because most physicians who become child psychiatrists haven't a clue. They usually do what their predecessor, their mentor, what somebody taught, and they haven't been able to move beyond that. Now, there are so many theories about child development. I thought it was pretty important that everybody will really understand why it's necessary to have certain basic principles. I've been giving similar lectures really for 50 years, and I have to tell you that human beings have really not changed that much in all this time. I think it's very important to realize that Homo sapiens, and not only human beings, mammals, in fact, not even mammals, everybody, the whole world, has really evolved in a way that is very interesting in terms of maturation and development. Now, what is maturation? I shall quote Spitz in his introduction to the first year of life. He said, "Maturation is the unfolding of phylogenetically evolved and therefore inborn function of the species which emerge in the course of embryonic development or are carried forward after birth as anlaga and become manifest at later stages in life." Now that sounds pretty complicated, but if we want to say, we're talking always about gene-environment interaction. Now development, that's different from maturation, which has its own timetable. It's the emergence of forms, of function, and of behavior which are the outcomes of exchanges between the organism on the one hand and the inner and outer environment on the other. Now, this seems like a pretty simple and straightforward theory, but it is not. The problem in terms of studying child development is that there is no unified theory. There wasn't 100 years ago, there wasn't 50 years ago, and there isn't today. So what we're going to do today is to go over many of the various paradigms or models of developmental theory. And then it's very important to learn what they are, but it's not important for you to do every one of them. Each one of you will find the particular framework that you like, but really it has to be appropriate to any individual child. Everyone is different. Human beings are different. Now, there's always been this controversy. Is medicine or psychiatry an art or a science? Well, think about this. Art, oh, it's right brain, it's female, it's creative. And what is science? It's left brain, it's male, it follows very specific patterns. Well, you know that this is ridiculous. But people stick with these concepts and these biases, and it has unfortunately influenced so many researchers and scientists. Aristotle was probably the first proponent of the view that the environment is the primary determinant of thought and behavior. The child begins life as a tabula rasa. All subsequent sensory impressions are written on that blank tablet. Take Skinner right now, 50 years ago. He said literally, it's all environmental. I can take any child from birth, no matter what his genetic heritage, no matter what his background, no matter what his social class, and I can make him anything I want him to be. Tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor. And he was completely convinced of this. And a lot of people really followed that and said, no matter who it is, the environment is all important. Well, the environment is very important, but I think that people are forgetting the substrate, the human condition that led to this particular individual becoming who he is. So that you have this unbelievable biases, discrepancies, fights in the scientific world. A few years ago, people became very interested in research. And what did that mean? To research something that was just an art or just working with people. It's what everybody's grandmother did. It was folklore, it was mythology. What was this? About 50 years ago, people began to study parental attitudes. We all know that what happens when you're a child and very young influences later life. But what about the attitude of the parent? Was toilet training very important in terms of the child's development? Was breast or bottle feeding the most important determinant of the future character of this child. Finally, I think people began to realize it wasn't just one event, but it was accumulation of thousands of events in the child's life, as long as parental attitude that really determined the outcome of this human being. Well, that's why we're going to spend a little time on going over some of these paradigms. Now, I'm a psychoanalyst, a child and adult, as I mentioned before, but that doesn't mean I don't take very seriously operant conditioning, behavioral, medication, family work, community, public health. They're all tremendously important in terms of our dealing with people. Attempting to present a unified view of the current state of child development is like having the proverbial blind men discuss the elephant, each describing with scrupulous detail that portion of the elephant's anatomy which happens to present itself to the examiner's particular touch without considering his colleagues' perceptions. Now, during the last 50 years, a number of developmental schools have gained prominence. All claim as their own the infant field of child development. It's very interesting with every individual you see to know which theory really applies the most. The first one is one that every pediatrician, general practitioner, nurse, everyone knows, the maturational stages. And so we have 0 to 7 days, the first weeks, 8 to 16 weeks, all the way through adolescence. And it's pretty important just to know the height, the weight, the growth, what's happening with the body of the child. And it's very good because it is actual data that you can look at, that every pediatrician has. Famous pediatrician who became a psychiatrist later, David Levy, used to have his own little experiment. Let's say a mother brings in her 3-month-old baby, and he'd say, "Oh, Miss Smith, what a beautiful baby you have." And he said if she looked at the baby and smiled, he knew this was a very solid, good relationship, mother and child. If she just looked sad and depressed and didn't look at the child and just handed him over, he knew somebody was in trouble there, and it was probably the mother, and he would make a little note. And this is a very early experiment of his that he would do in the office. Now, the second theory of development, paradigm, I should say, is the one of cognitive development of Piaget, which is very, very important. Because how many times those of you who are clinicians have gone to the ward and seen a 16-year-old boy and say, he's very negative, he's very oppositional, he isn't listening to anything we do, when the problem is he doesn't understand. He has a learning disability, or is intellectually deficient, and they don't notice. They just think this is a kid who's on purpose getting in a lot of trouble. So it's very important to know and measure the Piagetian stages of development. So he was really very interested in the question of how the child understands the world around him, how the various stages of conceptual thought evolve and unfold, as it were, stage by stage, with each maturational level. So he goes into some wonderful little experiments that I think everybody would be tremendously interested in terms of early life, the quote latency period, school age, and when concrete operations, when a child is able to really think and solve a problem, and then to abstract thinking, which is a much higher level that I would say millions of people in this country have not achieved, the abstract thought. The next paradigm is one that I am very familiar with, and one that we're going to be spending a lot of time with because it's concepts of Freud. It's the psychosexual stages of Sigmund Freud. Now, what is this? He called it the oral stage, which is the mouth as the cradle of perception, according to Renee Spitz. The oral stage is the active, aggressive biting of the child who's just developing teeth. It's when breastfeeding usually stops suddenly. Subsequent stages are concerned with the anal and phallic zones. These are all stages of Freudian development. Now, does that mean that all of you should follow exactly what Freud said and evolved? Not at all. But it's just like a little roadmap of psychodynamic theory that it's very good for you to know whether you decide to go into psychoanalysis or not. Erikson was a really wonderful educator, brilliant man, and he evolved his 8 stages of man, starting with oral stage, which he says is really basic trust versus mistrust. And in many of the cases that we're going to be studying, if a person has never achieved basic trust, because let's say he was reared in an institution or had severe early trauma, never been able to trust anyone, you can't go ahead and be at one of the later stages in school age, for example, when he hasn't achieved basic trust. And it means that the kind of treatment that child gets is one to establish that bond which has never existed. Everybody should really read Erikson's Childhood and Society. He had such wonderful theories. For example, he talked about initiative versus guilt. Now, what does that mean? A little boy at 5 years old tries something. He takes a pen and he writes on the walls. And then his father comes in and screams at him and yells and spanks him. So he had some initiative in doing this, but at the same time felt very guilty and may never pick up a pen or crayon again. So there's so much that Erikson saw, not only in the child, but also in the external environment and how he was reared. It goes into latency, which is industry versus inferiority. Why would a child who was so smart and so bright and didn't have trauma in his life, why would that child suddenly be very unhappy and depressed and not want to go to school? Well, perhaps he had a learning disability that was never picked up. And it's very important to deal with that and not to put that child in analytic treatment when he really needs a very good remediation. So that's why it's very important, and I think the Erikson tells us so much. And then the young adulthood. Is he able to achieve intimacy, or is he feeling isolated in his life and unable to really connect with other people? And then as an adult human being, if 30 to 45 or 50, generativity, really, he's really exploring all aspects of his life and what he can be and what he can become in terms of relationships, in terms of work, or will he just stagnate? Erikson's last stage was ego integrity versus despair. Some of you may prefer reading Shakespeare, The 7 Ages of Man, because it's all the same. It's quite amazing because think of all the people you know, everyone in your life, neighbors, friends, family, characters in books, and you can learn so much from just using this simple paradigm of where is he on the Eriksonian scale. Now, my very favorite, I shouldn't say that because I love the Freudian. I love them all, actually. But my maybe very favorite is Bowlby, because what Bowlby did, he was an amazing ethologist. He loved Darwin. He loved the study of the whole animal world and the animal kingdom, and he studied them very extensively. And he was so brilliant in terms of his attachment theory. And he studied wonderful experiments of Lorenz, the baby geese that followed the mother, and the same thing whether he was studying monkeys. The theories of attachment in monkeys, he felt it was so important and had little to do with simply the child's need for food, but it was need for inborn attachment, and that this is what ran through all society. And the funny thing was, I met Bowlby once at a lecture and introduced myself. He was the sweetest man. He was in from England, and he told me, you know, I really believe very much in attachment. I have many children and they all live within 1 block of one another, and we all see each other all the time. He actually lived that life, and his children didn't want to leave.